Dear students, in last class we have discussed about the ignition temperature. Now, today I also repeat the definition of ignition temperature. Ignition temperature. What is ignition temperature? Ignition temperature is the lowest temperature. Ignition temperature is the lowest temperature at which a substance catches fire. Means the temperature at which substance catch fire is known as ignition temperature. We also discussed matchstick does not catch fire on its room temperature. Why matchstick does not catch fire on room temperature? Because room temperature is not a ignition temperature. Means it is not a temperature which provide temperature to the matchstick for catching fire. So room temperature is not a ignition temperature. That's why the matchstick does not catch fire. Now in today's class we will perform an activity which is based on the ignition temperature. We take two paper cups. We make two paper cups folding with sheet of paper. Okay, we prepare two paper cups. Now we take two candles. We take two candles. Both are burning candles. In one paper cup we filled 50 ml water, but in another paper cup it is empty. This is empty paper and this is paper which contain 50 ml of water. Now we burn both the paper with the help of candle. We see the paper which contain 50 ml water does not catch fire. Does not catch fire. Why? Why this has happened? Because when we burn the water containing paper, then water containing paper cup contain water. So candle provide the heat to the paper, then water absorb the heat. The water absorb the heat. So the ignition temperature not reach to the paper. Means paper does not contain ignition temperature. That's why the paper does not burn with the help of candle if it contain water, because for burning of paper ignition temperature is required, but due to the presence of water the water absorb the heat, so the ignition temperature is not reached. That's why the paper not burning. In second condition, paper is empty. When we burn the paper, heat released through the candle which absorbed by the paper, so the ignition temperature is reached. That's why paper catches the fire. But in this condition paper doesn't catches the fire because ignition temperature is not reached. Okay, the paper cup is transferred to the water. Okay, the heat supplied to the paper cup is transferred to the water. That's why presence of water ignition temperature of paper is not reached and paper does not burn. So the substance which have very low ignition temperature and can easily catches fire with a flame are called inflammable substance. Those substance which have low ignition temperature and easily catch fire with a flame, means the substance catch fire and also burn with a flame, are known as inflammable substance. For example, petrol, alcohol, liquefied petroleum gas. These are inflammable substances which have low ignition temperature and can easily catch fire with a flame. Okay. Now, we will discuss how does petrol fire. How does petrol fire? You all are heard about the fire breaking out in homes, shop, factories. You have seen such an accident. Different type of accidents you have listened, heard related to the fire. Or we know that fire brigade come and firemen extinguish the fire by throwing water under pressure. Now fire will be stopped. Then when a fire brigade arrive, what does it do? It pours water on the fire. Water cool the combustible material so that its temperature is brought below its ignition temperature. Means with the help of water the ignition temperature below down, the temperature brought below its ignition temperature. That's why this prevent the spreading of fire. So the spreading of fire is prevented by the throw of water. Why? Because water decreases the ignition temperature. When ignition temperature decreases, then spreading of fire will be stopped, because a minimum temperature is required for burning a substance. With the help of water, ignition temperature decreases. That's why fire does not spread. Okay, clear? That's why water is helpful for preventing the spreading of fire. Now you also have learned that there are three essential requirements for producing fire. Three essential requirements for producing fire. These are fuel, air, and heat. These are three favorable conditions for producing fire, because for any substance catching fire, air is required. In the absence of air, combustion is not possible. So air is required, fuel also is required, and heat. Three substances are required for producing fire, because air supply oxygen, which is helpful for combustion, and heat raise the temperature, which belongs to the ignition temperature. Heat increases the temperature, which reaches to the ignition temperature. When substance reaches to the ignition temperature, then easily catches the fire. So three things are required for producing fire. Now clear? Now we will discuss about the fire extinguisher. Fire extinguisher is helpful for preventing the spreading of fire. The most common fire extinguisher is water, because water decreases the ignition temperature. So water is the most common fire extinguisher, but water works only when things like wood, paper are on fire. Then water is applicable. But if electrical equipment is on fire, then water is not helpful, because water conduct electricity. It harms those trying to douse the fire. So we cannot use water on electricity fire. We use only when wood and paper are on fire. On electrical equipment on fire, we cannot use water. So water is not suitable for fire involving oil and petrol. So for fire involving electrical equipment and inflammable material like petrol, carbon dioxide is the best extinguisher. CO2 being heavier than oxygen cover the fire like a blanket. CO2 is heavier than oxygen, then it cover the fire like a blanket. Since the contact between the fuel and oxygen is cut off, the fire is controlled. So nowadays we use fire extinguisher. In this extinguisher, it contains CO2 gas. CO2 gas is provide a blanket between the fuel and oxygen. So oxygen cannot come in contact with the fuel, so it prevent the fire. So it works, CO2 works like a blanket. So nowadays we use CO2 gas for controlling the fire, since the contact between the fuel and oxygen is cut off and fire is easily controlled. The added advantage of CO2 is that in most it does not harm the electrical equipment. So CO2 is very useful for stopping the fire on electrical equipments, because CO2 does not harm the electrical equipment, and it provide a blanket between the fuel and air. So we use CO2 gas. How we supply the CO2 gas? It can be stored at high pressure as a liquid in cylinder. This is a cylinder. In this cylinder we contain CO2 gas in liquid form. So CO2 gas is filled in this container in liquid form, as a liquid in the cylinder. In what form is the LPG stored in cylinder? When released from the cylinder, CO2 expand enormously in volume and cool down. So it not only form a blanket around the fire, it also bring down the temperature of the fuel. So when we open this cylinder, then CO2 gas is released. It spread around the fire, so it provide the blanket, and it also provide the blanket, and it also control the air which come in contact with the fuel. Okay, clear? so it also bring down the temperature of the fuel. It also decreases the ignition temperature of the fuel. So it is very very useful for preventing the spreading of fire. That's why we use fire extinguisher, because in fire extinguisher it contain CO2 gas, and CO2 gas is provide a blanket between the fuel and air, and it also decreases the ignition temperature. That's why fire is controlled. Clear? Now in next class we will discuss the type of combustion. Thank you so much.